Ilara was 24 when her world was dismantled with the quiet efficiency of a legal notice. Her stepfather, a man named Alistair, whom her mother had married in a spell of late-life loneliness, sat across from her at the heavy oak table her mother had built. He did not meet her eyes. He instead focused on a smudge on the rim of his teacup, as if it were the most pressing matter in the world. The house, the workshop, the acres of timber that hummed with the ghosts of her mother's labor, all sold. A neat, tidy package deal. "The paperwork is final," he said, his voice as dry as sawdust. "The new owners take possession at the end of the month. You have until then." He pushed a small, thin envelope across the polished wood. "This is what's left after settling her debts. A final consideration." She did not open it. She could feel the insult through the cheap paper. A few bills, a gesture meant to signal closure, not support. Her mother, a master blacksmith and engineer whose hands could coax strength and grace from raw iron, had left no debts. She had left a legacy of competence, a fortress of love and skill built around her only daughter. A fortress Alistair had just sold for a pittance to a logging consortium. Ilara had learned everything at her mother's side. From the age of 5, she'd known the sharp, metallic scent of the forge, the hiss of hot steel quenched in oil, the satisfying thud of a well-seated mortise. Her mother had taught her not just the how, but the why. How to read the grain of wood, the stress lines in metal, the language of weight and balance. Why integrity in your work was the same as integrity in your soul. While other girls learned needlepoint, Ilara learned to true a gearshaft and temper a chisel. Her hands were not soft, but they were capable. They knew how to build, how to fix, how to create. What about her things? Ilara's voice was flat, a carefully constructed wall against the tremor of grief. Alistair finally looked up, his expression one of mild irritation, as if she were a piece of stubborn, uncooperative machinery. Most of it was considered part of the workshop. The forge, the lathes, the tools, it's all gone. He waved a dismissive hand. "There is one item. That monstrosity of a stove she built. The buyers didn't want it. Too big, they said. Too ornate. If you can have it moved, it's yours. Otherwise, it goes for scrap." The stove, her mother's magnum opus, a behemoth of cast iron and polished steel, with warming ovens, a complex flue system, and a firebox big enough to hold a grown man. It was the heart of their home, a source of unwavering warmth. On its front, a heavy, intricately cast brass handle controlled the main damper. It was shaped like a coiled serpent, holding a sphere in its mouth, a piece of artistry her mother had spent a month perfecting. That handle was the last thing her mother had shown her how to cast, guiding Ilara's smaller hands as they poured the molten brass. It was more than a tool. It was a memory made solid. She did not cry. She did not plead. She gave a single, sharp nod. The stove was hers. It was the only thing that mattered. She stood, leaving the envelope untouched on the table. In that quiet act of defiance, she severed the last tie to the man who had erased her mother's life. She would take the stove. It was her inheritance, the sum total of her mother's tangible worth in a world that had never truly understood her. And within it, sealed and silent, lay a plan for exactly this day. The first task was a lesson in physics and desperation. The stove weighed nearly a ton. Moving it was an engineering problem, and Ilara approached it as her mother would have, with methodical calm. She used most of the money from the insulting envelope to hire a freight hauler, a grim-faced man named Jeb with a sturdy wagon and a team of 4 massive draft horses. He took one look at the stove and spat into the dust. "That ain't a stove, miss. That's an anchor for a mountain," he grumbled. But he was a man who respected a challenge. Together, using a system of levers, rollers, and a block and tackle Ilara rigged from the workshop's main beam, they painstakingly winched the iron beast onto the reinforced wagon bed. Alistair watched from a window. A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, on his face that a young woman could command such knowledge. When the stove was finally secured, lashed down with heavy chains, Alara climbed onto the wagon seat beside Jeb, her only other possession a single canvas satchel containing a change of clothes, a whetstone, a small hand adze, and her mother's brass drafting calipers. She did not look back. They traveled north, away from the familiar rolling hills, and into the harsh, windswept country of the coast. The air grew sharp with the smell of salt and cold stone. Her mother had spoken of this place, the Northern Reach, a land of stark beauty and unforgiving weather. A place where things are what they are, she used to say. The rock is rock, the sea is sea. There's no pretending. Days blurred into a rhythm of creaking leather, the clop of hooves, and the silent, massive weight of the stove behind them. It felt less like cargo and more like a companion, a silent, iron-hearted guardian. She spent the nights huddled by a small fire, the brass calipers cool and solid in her hand, a tangible link to a lifetime of learning. In a rough port town called Saltwind, a collection of gray stone buildings huddled against the perpetual ocean wind, Jeb's contract was finished. He helped her move the stove into a temporary storage shed on the docks, his initial grumbling having turned into a quiet respect. "Whatever you're planning, miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I hope you've got the grit for it." That night, nursing a mug of weak ale in a tavern that smelled of stale beer and wet wool, she listened. She listened to the fishermen's talk of tides and catches, to the merchants' complaints about shipping rates, and then she heard it. Two men at the bar, laughing over a land auction. "Sold the old Tidemaster's Folly yet, Finn?" one asked. The other, a portly man with a florid face, snorted. "Who'd buy it? Cursed, they say. The sea's eating the foundation, the tower's cracked, and the ghost of old Manhem is still rattling his chains. We're practically giving it away just to get it off the port ledger." Alara's breath caught. Tidemaster's Folly. It was a name her mother had mentioned once, a story told late at night by the glow of the forge, a lighthouse station built on a treacherous point of rock, decommissioned decades ago, left to the mercy of the waves. An impossible place, a forgotten place. The next morning, she walked into the Port Authority office. The portly man, Finn, was behind the counter, stamping documents with an air of immense self-importance. She waited patiently until he deigned to look at her. "I'd like to purchase the deed to the old lighthouse station on Granite Spit," she said, her voice even. He stared at her, then broke into a wheezing laugh. "You? Little thing like you? What for? You planning on starting a colony of gulls?" "I want to buy it," she repeated, her gaze unwavering. He named a price, a ridiculously low sum, clearly meant to be a joke. It was almost exactly what she had left after paying Jeb. She counted the money out onto the counter. The worn bills and few remaining coins made a small, pathetic pile. Finn's laughter died in his throat. He looked from the money to her face, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. He shrugged, a greasy smile spreading across his face. "Your funeral, miss. The deed's yours. No refunds when the first winter storm washes you away." He filled out the paperwork with a flourish, his pen scratching across the page. He viewed the sale as a punchline, a story he would tell for years. He had no idea he was signing away a future. Getting the stove from the Saltwind docks to Granite Spit was the final, brutal test. No wagon could traverse the rocky, tide-washed causeway that connected the spit to the mainland at low tide. She spent 2 days studying the tides, using the knowledge her mother had drilled into her about lunar cycles and coastal charts. She then hired 2 fishermen with a shallow draft barge, paying them with the last of her silver coins. The journey across the churning gray water was short, but terrifying. The spit was a jagged finger of black rock, pointing accusingly at the sea. At its end stood the lighthouse, or what was left of it. The tower, stout but scarred, was missing its lantern room. Connected to it was the keeper's house, a stone structure whose roof had partially collapsed, leaving it open to the sky like a skull with a missing crown. A ruined boathouse clung precariously to the base of the cliff. It was worse than she had imagined. Far worse. As the fishermen maneuvered the barge against a crude stone jetty, a wave of cold despair washed over Alara, more chilling than the sea spray. The scale of the ruin was overwhelming. The air hung heavy with the smell of decay, of wet rot and briny dampness. This was not a home. It was a tombstone. For a moment she faltered. The weight of her loss, the folly of her purchase, the sheer, crushing loneliness of it all threatened to buckle her knees. She gripped the cold iron of the stove, her knuckles white. The stove. It was real. It was here. It was the first piece of the puzzle. She directed the fishermen, her voice tight but clear. Using the same principles of leverage and mechanical advantage, they wrestled the iron behemoth off the barge and onto the jetty. From there, it was a slow, agonizing crawl up a slight incline to the keeper's house. They left it on the stone porch, took her last coin, and departed without a word, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt. Alone. She was utterly alone, on a crumbling rock in the middle of a hostile sea, with nothing but a derelict building and a monstrously heavy iron stove. The wind howled around the corners of the broken house, a mournful, empty sound. She sank down onto the cold stone beside her inheritance, and finally let the tears come. They were hot and brief, a squall of grief that passed as quickly as it arrived. When it was over, she wiped her face on her sleeve, took a deep, shuddering breath of salt air, and got to work. Her mother had taught her that survival begins with shelter. Alara walked the perimeter of the keeper's house, her eyes assessing, calculating. Most of the structure was a lost cause for now. The main room was a mess of fallen timbers and sodden plaster. But on the north side, tucked against the base of the tower itself, was a small, stone-walled room that had once been a pantry. Its roof, sheltered by the tower's bulk, was mostly intact, and its single, small window was boarded over. It was defensible. It could be made warm. It took her the rest of the day, a grueling, back-breaking effort, to move the stove the final 20 feet from the porch into that pantry. She used splintered timbers as rollers and a long iron pry bar she found in the wreckage, her muscles screaming with every inch gained. Finally, it was in place, standing solid and black against the damp stone wall. It dominated the small room, an altar of iron. Exhausted, she collapsed on the floor, using her satchel as a pillow, and fell into a dreamless sleep, filled with the scent of rust and the groan of old wood. The next morning, she began to clean it. She swept out the decades of dust and grime, her hands rediscovering the familiar lines of its construction. She polished the steel trim, ran her fingers over the maker's mark, a stylized falcon in flight, her mother's sigil. And then she turned to the firebox. The door was sealed shut. Alistair had assumed it was rusted, but Alara knew her mother's work. Nothing her mother made ever ceased from mere neglect. She examined the heavy cast-iron door. There was no visible lock, no keyhole, but her eyes, trained to see the minute details of construction, noticed something. The hinges were not standard, and the ornate brass damper handle, the coiled serpent, felt different. It was heavier than it should be. She remembered her mother's words, spoken years ago as they worked on its design. Everything should have more than one purpose, Alara, especially the beautiful things. Her heart began to beat faster. She gripped the brass handle and pulled. It was solid. She twisted it. It turned the damper, just as it was supposed to. But then, acting on a sudden surge of intuition, a memory of her mother's love for puzzles and hidden mechanisms, she pushed the handle inward, toward the body of the stove. It didn't move. She tried pulling it straight out from its collar. It resisted, then slid out with a smooth, oiled click. It wasn't just a handle. The serpent's tail extended into a long, cylindrical brass rod, intricately notched and grooved along its length. It was a key, a complex, magnificent key. Her hands trembled as she searched the firebox door again. Near the bottom hinge, almost invisible against the black iron, was a tiny, perfectly round hole, no bigger than her little finger. It was a keyhole disguised as a casting flaw. With painstaking care, she inserted the brass rod. It slid in perfectly. She turned it. A sequence of satisfying clicks echoed from within the door, the sound of finely machined tumblers falling into place. A deep, resonant thunk sounded from inside the firebox. She pulled the handle, and the heavy iron door, a door that had not been opened since her mother sealed it, swung open on silent, perfectly balanced hinges. The firebox was not empty. It was not filled with ash or rust. It was pristine, the bare iron clean and smooth. In its center sat a heavy, welded iron chest, a falcon sigil etched into its lid. A wave of dizziness washed over her. This was it. This was the plan. Her mother had known. She had foreseen Alistair's cold pragmatism, his dismissal of her daughter, his blindness to true value. The stove was not an inheritance. It was an ark, built to carry her daughter through the coming flood. She lifted the chest out. It was heavy, solid. It was not locked. She lifted the lid, and the sight within stole her breath. The box was lined with oilcloth. On top lay a thick, sealed envelope, bearing her name in her mother's familiar, strong script. Beneath it, nestled in tight, neat rows, were gold coins, hundreds of them, heavy, gleaming sovereigns, minted in a dozen different years. It was a fortune, more money than she had ever imagined, a silent testament to a genius that the world had overlooked, but that had provided for its own. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal on the envelope. The letter inside was written on thick, durable vellum. "My dearest Alara," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the world has proven to be as small-minded as I feared. I am sorry I could not protect you from this, but I have done the next best thing. I have armed you. The man I married does not see you. He sees a girl with grease under her fingernails. He does not understand that those hands can build a world. I knew he would not keep you, and he would not value what is truly mine to give. So I gave it to you in the only way I could, hidden in plain sight. The gold is from patents, small things mostly. A new type of bearing, a more efficient flue design, a gearing system for a mill. I sold them quietly over the years. I told Alistair the money was spent on foolish whims. He believed it. He never looked closely at my work, only at the dirt it left on my clothes. This gold is your freedom. Use it to buy your materials, your time, your independence. Never let anyone make you feel small for the work you do. But the money is the least of this inheritance, Alara." Tucked beneath this letter are my private survey logs and plans. Do you remember the stories of the Tidemaster's Folly? I visited it 5 years ago. I told Alistair I was going fishing. I spent a week there, surveying, measuring, documenting. It is a place of good stone and strong bones, despite its neglect. It is a place for you. The plans will show you its secrets. The foundation is compromised on the seaward side, yes, but the bedrock beneath is solid. The plans show you how to build a new seawall, where to quarry the stone. They show you the location of a freshwater cistern, hidden beneath the floor of the main room, fed by a deep artesian well. They show you a hidden sea cave, accessible only at low tide through the back of the ruined boathouse. I had planned it as my final workshop, a place to hear the sea and the ring of the hammer. This is my true legacy to you, my daughter. Not the gold, but the knowledge, the foresight, the plan. I have given you the tools your entire life. Now I give you the blueprints. Build your fortress. Build your life. Be the tidemaster of your own fate. Know that every stone you lay, every beam you raise, you do so with my love as your foundation. Your mother. Tears streamed down Alara's face, dripping onto the vellum. They were not tears of grief, but of profound, aching gratitude. Her mother was not gone. She was here, in the ink, in the numbers on the blueprints, in the solid weight of the gold coins. She was in the very iron of the stove that now stood as a silent sentinel in this ruined place. Her mother had given her more than a life raft. She had given her a harbor and a map to navigate it. The despair of the previous day was burned away in the fire of this revelation. She was not an outcast. She was an heir. She was not a victim. She was the custodian of a legacy. She carefully folded the letter, placed it in her satchel, and unrolled the blueprints on the dusty floor. In the fading light, she saw not a ruin, but a project. The work could begin. The next day, Alara began. Her mother's plans were her guide, her mother's love her fuel. The first task was the seawall. The plans showed a design for an interlocking, angled wall that would use the power of the waves to settle itself more firmly into the seabed, rather than fighting them. She spent a week just observing the tides, the currents, the way the waves struck the crumbling foundation, matching her observations to her mother's notes. She found the quarry her mother had marked, a shelf of hard, dense granite, just above the high tide line. Using the pry bar, wedges, she forged herself over a driftwood fire, and sheer, relentless effort, she began to break loose the stones. It was brutal, punishing work. Her muscles ached, her hands bled, but with each stone she moved, she felt a fierce joy. This was not labor. It was a conversation with her mother across time. Her solitary work did not go unnoticed. An old fisherman named Silas, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by sun and sea, often anchored his small dory in the cove to check his crab pots. He watched her for days, a silent observer in his oilskins. He saw her wrestling stones twice her size, consulting her charts, working from dawn until dusk, with a focus that was almost unnerving. He saw not madness, but a deep and abiding purpose. One morning, as she struggled to move a particularly large cornerstone, Silas rowed his dory to the jetty. He didn't offer help, which she would have refused. Instead, he pointed a gnarled finger at the stone. "That one's got a green vein," he said, his voice a low rumble like stones rolling in the surf. "It'll split clean if you strike it there. And there," he pointed again. "Use the sea's water. The salt makes the fisher run true." He said nothing more, just nodded and rowed away. The next day, a pile of salt-cured, iron-hard driftwood, perfect for scaffolding, was neatly stacked on her jetty. With the seawall progressing, she turned her attention to the keeper's house. She needed timber, tools, and supplies. She took a handful of the gold sovereigns and sailed to Saltwind with Silas, who offered the passage as a matter of course. In the town, she sought out the blacksmith, a man named Corin. His forge was the largest in the region, his reputation as formidable as his size. She entered the clangor and heat of his workshop and waited. When he finally turned from his anvil, sweat glistening on his bare arms, he eyed her with suspicion. "What do you want?" "I need to use your forge," she said, "and I need to buy steel stock, good quality." She placed a gold sovereign on a cluttered workbench. Coran laughed, a short, sharp bark. "My forge isn't for rent, girl, and that coin won't buy you 5 minutes of my time." Instead of arguing, Alara walked to a pile of scrap metal. She picked up a broken gear tooth and a length of pitted iron rod. "The winch on your boat lift," she said. "The gearing is mismatched. It groans because the load isn't distributed evenly across the teeth. The wear will shear the main axle in the next 6 months." She tossed the gear tooth back on the pile. "I can draw you a template for a new set of gears. A progressive helical cut. It will double the life of the winch and increase its lifting power by 1/3. Corin fell silent. He stared at her, his eyes narrowing. He had been fighting with that winch for a year. No one had been able to diagnose the problem. He picked up the gold coin, flipped it in the air, and caught it. "Draw the template," he grunted. "The forge is yours for 2 days a week. Stock as it cost." It was not an offer of charity. It was a contract between equals, a recognition of skill that transcended gender and age. Her third ally was Maeve, the woman who ran the general store and freight service. Maeve had been the one to arrange Jeb's wagon, her expression a mask of polite pity. When Alara returned and began ordering large quantities of lime for mortar, linseed oil, and panes of glass, paying in gold, Maeve's pity turned to curiosity. She saw the new calluses on Alara's hands, the quiet confidence in her eyes. When a storm delayed a shipment of roofing slate Alara had ordered, Maeve hired 2 extra men and a sturdier boat to make sure it got to the spit the moment the weather cleared. "A woman building in a place like that," Maeve told her husband, "needs her slate on time." Word of the crazy woman on the spit began to change. She was no longer a fool to be pitied, but an enigma to be respected. The change was cemented the day Finn, the port clerk, motored out with 2 cronies, eager to show them the ruin he'd so cleverly sold. They rounded the point and fell silent. Instead of a crumbling wreck, they saw a new, formidable seawall of expertly fitted stone, turning the waves aside with calm indifference. They saw the keeper's house, its roof completely rebuilt and slated, with new, glazed windows gleaming in the sun. They saw Alara, high on a scaffold against the lighthouse tower itself, methodically chipping out old, rotten mortar and pointing the joints with fresh material. She paused, looked down at their boat, and simply nodded, a queen surveying her domain. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply went back to her work, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of her hammer and chisel echoing across the water. Humbled and speechless, Finn turned his boat around and fled back to port. Autumn deepened, the winds growing colder, the sea turning a furious shade of gray. Alara, following her mother's plans, had focused her recent efforts on the lighthouse tower. The original lamp and its complex clockwork rotation mechanism were still there, coated in rust and verdigris, but largely intact. Her mother's notes called it a masterpiece of optics and mechanics. Using the skills she'd learned from Corin and the resources of his forge, Alara began the painstaking process of restoring it. She disassembled the mechanism piece by piece, cleaning, machining new parts, polishing the great Fresnel lens until it shone. She ordered a new, high-intensity petroleum burner, the best her gold could buy. She didn't know why, only that her mother's plans had allocated significant time to this task. The answer came in late November. A storm, a monster of a nor'easter, boiled up from the depths of the Atlantic without warning. The sky turned a bruised purple-black, and the sea rose in a terrifying, frothing rage. Waves that dwarfed the new seawall crashed against the tower, sending spray 100 feet into the air. The wind screamed, a physical force that threatened to tear the new roof from the keeper's house. Inside, with the iron stove radiating a defiant warmth, Alara felt the entire structure shudder with each impact. She was safe. Her mother's design, her own labor, had held. But as she looked out a storm shutter, she saw a light bobbing frantically in the churning darkness. A boat. It was being driven relentlessly toward the Dragon's Teeth, a notorious reef just north of her spit. The modern automated beacon, miles out to sea, was a useless smear of light in the blinding rain. A cold dread seized her. She recognized the boat's silhouette. It was Silas's dory, but larger. It was his son's fishing vessel. Through her spyglass, she could see figures on the deck, fighting to control it. Their engine was dead. Her mother's plan. The lamp. It all crashed into place. She raced up the winding stairs of the tower, her heart pounding against her ribs. The storm howled around her, but inside the newly restored lamp room, it was still. The great lens waited, a sleeping crystal eye. She had practiced this. She primed the burner, the smell of petroleum sharp and clean. With a twist of a valve and the scratch of a match, the mantle caught, flaring to life with a brilliant, white-hot hiss. The lamp was lit, but a static light was not enough. They needed the old signal, the Tidemaster's signal. She engaged the clockwork mechanism she had so carefully rebuilt. The gears meshed with a soft whir. The entire massive assembly, tons of glass and brass, began to turn. A powerful, piercing beam of light sliced through the tempest, one long, steady beam, sweeping across the waves. It was the old safe harbor signal for Granite Spit, a signal not seen in 50 years, a signal detailed in the margins of her mother's charts. On the stricken boat, Silas's son saw it. He knew the stories. He knew what it meant. The beam gave them a fixed point in the chaos. It illuminated the treacherous reef and, more importantly, the narrow, deep channel that led into the protected cove behind the lighthouse, the very cove where Alara had found her mother's hidden sea cave workshop. Guided by the steady, sweeping light, they wrestled their boat through the passage, surfing on the back of a monster wave into the relative calm of the cove, just as their steering failed completely. When the storm finally broke at dawn, the sea was calm, the sky a pale, washed-out blue. Alara went down to the cove. Silas was there, along with Corin and half the men from the village. They had repaired the boat's engine. Silas's son, a young man with his father's quiet eyes, walked up to her. He said nothing but gripped her hand, his own calloused and raw from the ordeal. It was a gesture of gratitude more profound than any words. Corin clapped her on the shoulder, his hand a heavy, warm weight. "The old light," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved them. You're a true Tidemaster, girl." She had done it. She had not just restored a building. She had restored its purpose. She had fulfilled the promise of her mother's legacy, using the skill she was given and the foresight she was bequeathed to become a guardian of the very community that had first seen her as an outcast. Months later, spring had returned to the northern reach. The lighthouse station on Granite Spit was no longer a folly. It was a home, solid and beautiful, a testament to work and resilience. The keeper's house was warm and bright, the scent of baking bread from the iron stove mingling with the clean smell of salt air. The workshop in the sea cave was fully equipped, the ring of Alara's hammer a familiar sound to the gulls. She stood on the high parapet of the tower, watching the sunset, painting the sky in hues of orange and rose. The sea was calm, a gentle swell breaking on the seawall far below. She was not alone anymore. Silas brought her fish, Maeve brought her news and supplies, and Corin came to argue with her about engineering, his respect a hard-won, unbreakable thing. She was part of the fabric of this place, woven in by shared hardship and mutual respect. On the workbench in her new workshop, two objects lay side by side. One was the heavy, ornate brass damper handle, the serpent key that had unlocked her future. The other was a piece of sea-smoothed granite, a perfect heart-shaped stone Silas had given her, warm from the sun, the inheritance of skill and the gift of belonging. She looked out at the vast expanse of water, the brass calipers from her satchel cool in her pocket. She understood now that her mother's true inheritance was never the gold. The gold was just a tool, like a hammer or a chisel. The real legacy was the knowledge in her hands, the strength in her back, the unshakable belief that a person's worth is measured by what they can build, not what they possess. The iron stove was not just a stove. It was a vessel of love, a blueprint for survival, a fortress built by a mother for the daughter she knew would be strong enough to command it. The small, insulting sum she had paid for this pile of ruins, for this cursed and forgotten rock, was, without a single doubt, the best money she had ever spent.